He had debated the options, weighed them for at least 3 weeks, and had finally arrived at a decision, had secured the weapons, the ammunition, and decided that he would do it. He made very elaborate plans to carry out the killings in a serial fashion. He did not want 2 of the family members to be present at the same time.
On a quiet winter day in December 1971, police unlocked the doors of a sprawling mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Inside, they made a grim discovery. The bodies of 5 family members were found inside the home, each one carefully arranged. There were no signs of forced entry, and strangely, the house felt untouched. Music still played softly from the radio, and lights were left on. As investigators searched the home, they found a handwritten letter. In the letter, the murderer calmly explained why he believed killing the family was the right thing to do. The person responsible wasn't hiding among the victims. He was gone. The killer was John List, a quiet religious father who vanished without a trace after murdering his wife, children, and mother. For 18 years, he lived under a new identity, got a job, and even married another woman, all while one of the most chilling family murder cases in America remained unsolved. What kind of man believes murder is an act of mercy? How did John List disappear so completely and live a normal life while the world searched for him? And what mistake finally exposed the killer who thought he had escaped forever? This is the haunting true story of John List, a man who erased his family and nearly erased himself. Welcome to Crime Aura, where the darkest true crime stories come to life. We bring you gripping stories every week, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay in the loop. Now, let's dive into today's story. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, John Emil List made a decision that would wipe out his entire family. Inside the garage of his large Westfield, New Jersey home, John retrieved 2 old handguns. He paused, took a deep breath, and then walked calmly into the kitchen. Without warning, he raised a stair pistol and shot his wife. Helen List slid from her chair and collapsed onto the cold tile floor. But this was only the beginning. John List turned away from the kitchen and walked toward the staircase. Step by step, he climbed to the 3rd floor of the house, in a small apartment where his 84-year-old mother, Alma, lived. That morning, Alma was making breakfast. She had just placed a slice of bread into the toaster when her son entered the room. John raised the gun and shot his mother in the face. The bullet struck near her left eye, and Alma's body fell backward. John tried to carry her body, but she was too heavy for him to move, so he left her there on the floor. Blood spread across the room, soaking into the space where she had been standing only moments before. Then John walked back downstairs. He dragged his wife's body from the kitchen into the ballroom of the house. When that was done, he returned to the kitchen and began to clean. He cleaned the kitchen carefully, removing any signs of what had just happened. Then, as if following a routine, he prepared a simple meal and sat down to eat. Now the house was silent, and John List looked at the clock. There was still time, because he was not finished with the killings. And before the day was over, more lives inside that house would be taken by John Emil List. John List was born in Bay City, Michigan in 1925. His father, Frederick, was 61 years old, and his mother, Alma, was 38. Both parents were second cousins. They were strict German-American Lutherans who raised John in a deeply religious household. From an early age, he was quiet and withdrawn, preferring to stay to himself rather than socialize with other children. His father was stern and hardworking, with a strong belief in discipline and self-reliance. His mother was very different. She was intensely devoted to her son and closely involved in every part of his life. Together, they shaped him with a powerful sense of religious duty and moral responsibility that would remain central to who he was. After graduating from high school, John served in World War II. He saw heavy combat in Germany during the final weeks of the war. The experience reinforced his reserved nature and tendency to turn inward. When he returned home in 1946, he followed a conventional path. He attended college, earned a degree in business administration, and later moved to Virginia to begin building a career. In September 1951, John met Helen Taylor, a 25-year-old widow. The relationship moved quickly. About a month after they began dating, Helen told him she was pregnant. They got married later that year and settled in Michigan, where John became a stepfather to Helen's daughter, Brenda. Years later, Brenda became pregnant at 16 and was sent to a home for unwed mothers. John and Helen soon had children of their own. Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick were born within 4 years. John List was a responsible and serious father. He was not openly affectionate or playful, but he worked steadily, provided for his family, and took his role seriously. He believed he was doing what was expected of him. There was pride in meeting his obligations, even if emotional closeness was difficult for him to show. John List had long yearned for a taste of a better life. He first experienced it in Rochester, New York, after the family moved there in 1961. That year, he landed a managerial job with Xerox. The position came with a strong salary and an expense account, giving him access to comforts he had never known before. For the first time, life felt rewarding. That sense of security did not last. In 1965, Xerox fired John, telling him he could not keep up with the company as it continued to grow. The loss should have forced restraint. Instead, John and Helen aimed even higher. Soon after, John secured a job as vice president and comptroller at the First National Bank of Jersey City. With that title came renewed confidence, and the family turned their attention to Breeze Knoll. The house was far beyond what John could realistically afford, but appearances mattered. The family paid $50,000 for the property, borrowing $10,000 from his mother, Alma, to cover the down payment. To make the arrangement work, John remodeled the third floor so Alma could live there in a private apartment. From the outside, the move seemed like a sign of success and stability. But this would later put pressure on John List, pressure he never dealt with and only carried until it destroyed his entire family. By 1966, John List had lost his bank job again. With a wife and 3 children to support, the bills kept piling up, but he did not find new work. Instead, John kept up appearances. Every morning for 6 months, he would put on his suit, leave the house, and drive to the train station as if nothing had changed. He will sit there for hours, reading, then return home at the end of the day, pretending he had been at work the entire time. He refused to apply for unemployment benefits. His image was everything. He didn't want people to know. John List eventually found work again, landing an accounting job in New York City. That job lasted until 1969, when the company relocated to Long Island and let him go. After that, he tried selling life insurance. The income was not enough to cover expenses, so he began relying on his mother's bank account. By 1971, his financial situation had grown worse. FBI records showed John List earned just $7,400 that year. He took out a third mortgage, but it was not enough. By the fall of that year, he had fallen several months behind on payments. The bank informed him that foreclosure was approaching and time was running out. Over time, John began to see the people and responsibilities around him as burdens or threats, sometimes both. He would blame the purchase of Breeze Knoll on his mother, wife, saying both women were domineering and wanted the mansion more than he did. John also believed his 3 children were drifting away from the path of righteousness, even though their behavior gave little reason for concern. By all accounts, they were good kids. Still, he worried constantly. He feared they would be drawn in by the culture of the late 1960s and early 1970s. The music, the noise, and especially the drugs. His anxiety went far beyond what the facts seemed to justify. By the fall of 1971, Helen and Alma had formed their own suspicions about John List. The signs were there, and their doubts were not without reason. Whatever they believed, they never acted on it until it was far too late. On November 9, 1971, unusual letters arrived at the schools attended by John List's children. The messages explained that the family would be leaving town for several weeks to care for a sick relative. 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John, and 13-year-old Frederick were all expected to be absent for some time. The explanation seemed reasonable, and at first, no one questioned it. In the days that followed, their large mansion remained quiet. At night, its interior lights stayed on, glowing through the windows. They remained lit for days, then weeks. Slowly, one by one, the lights began to go dark. As time passed and no one saw the family return, neighbors began to grow uneasy. For weeks, the List's next-door neighbor, Dr. Bill Kunnick, had not seen anyone coming or going from Breeze Knoll. The house appeared empty, yet the lights stayed on, day and night, suggesting that someone was still inside. Kunnick assumed it might be Alma, quietly going about her routine. Then, without explanation, the lights began to go out altogether. Around the same time, Kunnick and his wife noticed a strange car lingering outside the house. Patricia's drama coach, Ed Iliano, had been troubled for weeks. He kept driving past the house, unsettled by the sudden disappearance of his student. Patty had given no warning that she was leaving town. Her absence was explained only by a letter. The explanation did not sit right with Iliano. On the night of December 7th, he persuaded a colleague to go with him to the List home to see what was happening. A little after 10 p.m., 2 officers from the Westfield Police Department arrived and entered the house along with Iliano. What truly unsettled them was the sound. Organ music drifted through the mansion's sound system. It played low, steady, and unbroken. The notes filled the rooms as if the house itself was holding a service. The mansion was almost completely dark when they stepped inside. The house was silent except for the organ music echoing through the sound system, low and constant. 2 police officers entered alongside Patricia's drama coach, moving carefully through the shadows of the mansion. In the living room, a single curtain separated the space from the ballroom. Ed Iliano reached out and pulled the curtain aside. As he did, Officer George Zalesnik raised his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and revealed what no one was prepared to see. 4 bodies lay arranged on the oak floor. They had been placed carefully on red and blue sleeping bags, now darkened and stiff with dried blood. The scene was deliberate, controlled, and deeply disturbing. The children were positioned side by side, still wearing the jackets they had put on for a cold fall day 4 weeks earlier. The placement suggested intent, not chaos. As the officers scanned the room, their flashlight caught drag marks on the floor that led into the kitchen. There, bullet holes scarred the walls. Blood-soaked rags, left behind in paper bags, had bled through and left another trail across the floor. On the counter sat 2 school textbooks beside young John's soccer bag. The officers knew the family numbered 6, so 2 people were still missing. Officers moved through the house with growing urgency, opening doors and searching room by room. On the 3rd floor, they found John's mother, Alma List, in her apartment. Her body lay twisted on the floor of a storage room. They moved to John List's study. Officers discovered something else entirely. Notes were taped neatly to the desk and filing cabinet, labeling what was inside and how to open it. One note pointed to a locked filing cabinet drawer. Inside, they found a manila folder containing letters John List had written before leaving the house. One addressed a $500 loan from his boss, explaining how it should be repaid, but one letter stood apart. Before they read a single line, officers sensed the weight of what lay inside the folder. This was not a rambling note or a cry for help. It is deliberate and carefully prepared. And as they began to read, it became clear that the letter did not soften the horror of what they had seen. It deepened it in ways they were not prepared for. Dear Pastor Raywinkle, I am sorry to add this additional burden to your work. I know that what has been done is wrong from all that I have been taught, and that any reasons that I might give will not make it right. But you are the one person that I know that, while not condoning this, will at least possibly understand why I felt that I had to do this. 1, I wasn't earning anywhere near enough to support us. Everything I tried seemed to fall to pieces. True, we could have gone bankrupt and maybe gone on welfare. 2, but that brings me to my next point. Knowing the type of location that one would have to live in, plus the environment for the children, plus the effect on them, knowing that they were on welfare, was just more than I thought they could and should endure. I know they were willing to cut back, but this involved a lot more than that. 3, with Pat being so determined to get into acting, I was also fearful as to what that might do to her, continuing to be Christian. I'm sure it wouldn't have helped. 4, also with Helen not going to church, I knew that this would harm the children eventually in their attendance. I had continued to hope that she would begin to come to church soon, but when I mentioned to her that Mr. Jutsa said he wanted to pay her an elder's call, she just blew up and said she wanted her name taken off the church rolls. Again, this could only have had an adverse result for the children's continued attendance. So that is the sum of it. If any one of these had been the condition, we might have pulled through, but this was just too much. At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now. If things had gone on, who knows if this would be the case. Of course, Mother got involved because doing what I did to my family would have been a tremendous shock to her at this age. Therefore, knowing that she is also a Christian, I felt it best that she be relieved of the troubles of this world that would have hit her. After it was all over, I said some prayers for them all from the hymn book. That was the least that I could do. Now for the final arrangements. Helen and the children have all agreed that they would prefer to be cremated. Please see to it that the costs are kept low. For Mother, she has a plot at the Frankenmuth Church Cemetery. Please contact Mr. Herman Shelkus, Route 4, Vassar, Michigan, 41768. He's married to a niece of Mother's and knows what arrangements are to be made. She always wanted Reverend Herman Zender of Bay City to preach the sermon, but he's not well. Also, I'm leaving some letters in your care. Please send them on and add whatever comments you think appropriate. The relationships are as follows: Mrs. Lydia Meyer, Mother's sister; Mrs. Eva Meyer, Helen's mother; Jean Seifert, Helen's sister. Also, I don't know what will happen to the books and personal things, but to the extent possible, I'd like for them to be distributed as you see fit. Some books might go to the school or church library. Originally, I had planned this for November 1st, All Saints' Day, but travel arrangements were delayed. I thought it would be an appropriate day for them to get to heaven. As for me, please let me be dropped from the congregation rolls. I leave myself in the hands of God's justice and mercy. I don't doubt that He is able to help us, but apparently He saw fit not to answer my prayers the way that I hoped they would be answered. This made me think that perhaps it was for the best as far as the children's souls are concerned. I know that many will only look at the additional years they could have lived, but if finally there were no longer Christians, what would be gained? Also, I'm sure many will say, how could anyone do such a horrible thing? My only answer is it isn't easy and was only done after much thought. Pastor, Mrs. Norris, may possibly be reached at 802 Pleasant Hill Drive, Elkin, home of her sister. One other thing, it may seem cowardly to have always shot from behind, but I didn't want any of them to know even at the last second that I had to do this to them. John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer. The rest were immediately out of pain. John didn't consciously feel anything either. Please remember me in your prayers. I will need them whether or not the government does its duty as it sees it. I'm only concerned with making my peace with God, and of this I am assured because of Christ dying even for me. P.S. Mother is in the hallway in the attic, 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move. John. For nearly 2 decades, this letter John left behind would be the last confirmed trace of John List. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the morning of November 9th, 1971. It was a quiet day in Westfield, New Jersey. Inside the large family home, the morning started like any other. John List woke up early and helped his children get ready for school. Breakfast was served, and everyone followed the usual routine. One by one, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick left the house and walked to school. None of them knew what was about to happen. When the children were gone, the house became quiet. John List then walked to the garage. There, he had already prepared 2 guns. One was a 9mm handgun that had belonged to his father. The other was an old .22 caliber pistol that he had kept from his time in the military. Inside the house was Helen List. Helen was more than just a name in this story. Before she married John, she had been married once before and had a daughter from that marriage. Later, she and John List had 3 children together. For many years, Helen was devoted to her family, but her adult life was also affected by a serious illness. During her first marriage, she had contracted syphilis from her husband. The illness went untreated for many years and later became severe. As time passed, the disease began to affect both her health and her behavior. By the late 1960s, Helen had changed. She stopped attending church regularly and often seemed withdrawn and unpredictable. Her illness became a hidden source of tension in the family. On the morning of November 9th, Helen sat at the kitchen table drinking her coffee. She had no idea it would be the last morning of her life. John List quietly walked up behind her and fired at close range. Helen died instantly. Also inside the house that morning was John's mother, Alma List. Alma was in her 80s. She had lived a long life built around faith, family, and daily routines. But that morning, her life also came to an end inside the same house. After both women were dead, John List waited for his children to come home from school. Later that afternoon, Patricia was the first to return. Patricia List was 16 years old. She loved drama and performing, and she often talked about being on stage one day. Friends remembered her as lively and full of energy. That afternoon, she walked back into her home expecting a normal day. Instead, her father was waiting. As she entered the house, John List shot her. He then carried her body into the ballroom and placed her beside her mother. Not long after, Frederick returned home. Frederick was 13 years old. When he stepped into the house that afternoon, he believed he was returning to the safety of home, but he never walked back out. The last child to return was John Jr. That evening, John Jr. had stayed late at school for a football game. In a strange attempt to appear normal, John List even went to watch the game. To the coaches and other parents, he looked like a supportive father cheering for his son. After the game ended, father and son drove home together. Once they were inside the house, John List shot his son. Unlike the others, John Jr. did not die immediately. There were signs that he struggled before his father fired again. Afterward, John carried his body into the ballroom and placed him beside the rest of the family. By around 5 o'clock that evening, John List had killed 5 members of his family. He carefully arranged their bodies side by side on sleeping bags. The once grand house had become silent and empty. John then lowered the thermostat to slow the process of decomposition and also turned on a radio and set it to play religious music through the home's intercom system. Outside the house, the town of Westfield continued its normal day. Neighbors had no idea that one of the darkest crimes in the town's history had already happened inside that home. It would take 28 days before anyone discovered the truth. By the time police finally entered the house and found the bodies along with John List's confession letter, he had already disappeared. But where exactly did John List go? The search for John List began quickly and stretched far. Law enforcement records show that through late 1971 and early 1972, investigators followed every lead they could find. Agents checked flight lists and chased reported sightings across states. Each tip raised hope, and each one fell apart. John List had few resources, but he was careful and methodical. With a 28-day head start, he planned his escape well. Investigators later learned he left his car at John F. Kennedy International Airport to mislead police. He cut his face out of family photos and burned them, along with his passport, in a backyard grill. Then he took a winding route by trains and buses toward the Midwest, arriving about 10 days later in Denver. In Denver, he used money from his mother to buy a trailer and also took a job that didn't match his past life, working as a line cook at a Holiday Inn. At first, John List was very cautious. He grew a mustache and changed how he dressed, trading suits for casual clothes and a low cap. The disguise mattered less than the times. He kept his head down, avoided trouble. For the first time in his life, he also stopped going to church. Over time, his guard lowered. As he settled into a new identity and a life without family duties, he grew more confident. 4 years after the murders, he returned to church, but chose a more mainstream congregation, thinking it would draw less attention. He also went back to accounting, preparing taxes for a carpet distributor. In 1977, John List took another step into his new life. He began dating a woman he met at a church singles event. Dolores Miller was quiet and deeply religious. John List had told her his first wife died of lung cancer and that he had no children. She would ask about his missing family ties, but eventually stopped pressing. Then, in 1985, 14 years and 14 days after the murders, John List, living under the name Robert P. Clark, married Dolores Miller, hoping the life he left behind would never catch up with him. Adam Walsh was 6 years old when he disappeared on July 27, 1981, from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. He had gone to the store with his mother. She allowed him to stay briefly in the toy department while she checked nearby aisles. When she returned a short time later, Adam was no longer there. At first, it looked like a child who had wandered away. Store staff called his name over the intercom, and employees searched the building. But as time passed, it became clear something was wrong. Adam did not come back. His family alerted police, and a large search effort began. Days went by with no clear leads. Officers and volunteers searched nearby streets, neighborhoods, and waterways. Missing person flyers with Adam's photo spread across the area. Soon, news of his disappearance reached the entire country. Many parents followed the story and worried about their own children's safety. 2 weeks later, Adam's remains were found in a canal far from the store. The discovery confirmed the family's fears and stunned the nation. The loss deeply affected his family and the public. For many Americans, the case changed how they thought about child safety. Parents became more watchful, and communities began taking missing child cases more seriously. Adam's father, John Walsh, chose to turn his grief into action. He started speaking publicly about the need for stronger laws, better coordination between police departments, and greater awareness about missing children. As he connected with other families, he realized many were facing similar tragedies. In 1983, a television movie titled Adam told his son's story. Millions of people watched it. At the end of the film, photos of missing children appeared along with a hotline number for tips. That broadcast helped locate several missing children and showed how powerful public involvement could be. Not long after, groups began printing photos of missing children on milk cartons. These images reached homes across the country. Adam's case helped push that effort forward and kept the issue in the public eye. John Walsh continued his work for child protection. He believed the public could help solve crimes if they were informed. In 1988, he became the host of America's Most Wanted, a show that presented real cases and asked viewers to share tips. Walsh viewed everyday citizens as partners in justice. Some critics called the show too dramatic, but it produced results. Viewer tips helped authorities find fugitives and uncover new leads. Law enforcement agencies began to see public participation as a useful tool. Around the same time, the John List case had gone cold. Investigators had few leads left. The idea of using national television to reach the public started to look like a possible solution. By 1988, Detective Jeffrey Paul Hummel still thought about the John List murders, even though the case was no longer his responsibility because he had moved to the narcotics unit. But the mystery of the family killings stayed with him. When he heard that the television show America's Most Wanted was telling stories of fugitives on national TV, he felt this case deserved a wider audience. Hummel reached out to Captain Frank Maranka, who led the Major Crimes Unit at the Union County Prosecutor's Office. Maranka presented the John List case to the show, but the producers turned it down. They believed the case was too old and unlikely to lead to an arrest. For a moment, it seemed like another dead end in a long investigation. Then a small opportunity appeared. Hummel received a flyer for a police conference he attended every year. The flyer announced that producers from America's Most Wanted would be there looking for stories. Hummel shared the news with Maranka, and the two saw a new chance to bring attention to the case. In January 1989, Hummel and Maranka met producer Michael Linder in the lobby of a Delaware hotel. They persuaded him to come up to their room to hear the full story of a case that had troubled New Jersey law enforcement for 18 years. Inside the room, they laid out crime scene photos across the beds to show the seriousness of the murders. When Linder left the room, Hummel and Maranka felt hopeful. They exchanged high fives, believing they had finally convinced the show to feature the case. Soon after, real preparations began. One of the first calls went to forensic sculptor Frank Bender. He had worked with the show's host, John Walsh, on other cases. Bender was mostly self-taught, but well known for creating faces from skulls and predicting how fugitives might look after many years. His Philadelphia studio displayed many sculpted heads from past cases, showing the unusual nature of his work. Bender used a few old photographs of John List, along with FBI information and a psychological profile, to build an aged bust. He even consulted anthropologists to understand how a man of German heritage might age, paying attention to details like the shape of the jaw and jowls. But Bender also trusted his instincts. He noticed that John List's mouth turned slightly upward in photos. For the sculpture, he turned the corners down. He explained this was not to show guilt, but fear of being caught. While the sculpture was being prepared, work continued in Westfield. Detective Bernard Tracy became the main contact for the TV producers. They needed to interview investigators and recreate scenes for the episode. To film a reenactment of the murders, Tracy convinced a local family to allow filming in their home. The show also needed people for a church scene. Tracy invited his own children and their friends to take part. His wife joined in as well, and the whole family appeared in the reenactment. The episode finally aired on Sunday, May 21st, 1989. Only 4 months after that meeting in Delaware. At the time, the show was just 30 minutes long. John List's case was featured first, alongside another murder case. From a studio in Washington, D.C., designed to look like a police station, host John Walsh told viewers they were about to see the oldest case ever shown on the program. After the reenactments, Walsh revealed Bender's clay bust of John List. The sculpture showed an older version of John List, with sagging jowls, thick glasses, and even the scar behind his right ear from childhood surgery. The glass eyes copied his distant, emotionless stare. For viewers, it was more striking than a typical mugshot because it suggested what List might look like after years in hiding. The program also showed the tip line in action. Phones rang as call takers answered one after another, similar to a telethon. Detectives from the prosecutor's office, Westfield police, and FBI agents helped handle the calls. Some callers simply shared a name and address. Others wanted to talk through their own ideas with a real investigator. By the end of the night, about 200 tips had come in. These leads were sorted and sent to 23 FBI field offices for follow-up. When the broadcast ended, everyone went home. The next morning, investigators began the careful work of checking each tip, hoping one of them would finally bring answers in a case that had remained open for nearly 2 decades. In a quiet living room in Aurora, Colorado, a 57-year-old woman named Wanda Flannery sat watching an episode of America's Most Wanted. She was known as a kind neighbor and a close friend to Dolores Clark. That night, her daughter Eva and her son-in-law Randy Mitchell were watching with her. None of them expected the program to connect to their own lives. As the story unfolded, Flannery's memories stirred. She recalled reading a tabloid article about John List in the Weekly World News. She had once shown that article to Dolores, but Dolores dismissed the idea that her husband could be the fugitive. At the time, it seemed far-fetched. But now, seeing the aged bust on the screen, Flannery felt a jolt of recognition. The sculpture looked exactly like the man who had lived near her for more than 2 years. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. Randy Mitchell had also met Dolores's husband, who went by the name Robert P. Clark. He lived in the same housing development and had spoken with him a few times. As the three sat together watching, a quiet agreement formed. They felt they had to report what they knew. They decided the call had to be made. Mitchell placed it for her. When he first reached the tip line, he asked if there was a reward. There was none. He hung up, then called again with more direct information. He explained that John List was now using the name Bob Clark. He provided a Virginia address which Flannery had saved from an envelope sent by Dolores in a letter. The person on the line sounded doubtful. Mitchell understood why. Tip lines receive many calls and not all are useful. He told them they could check the information or ignore it, but he was confident. He insisted they were looking at the right man. 11 days later, on June 1st, 1989, federal agents arrived at the Richmond home of a man known as Bob Clark. At the time, he was away at work. When the FBI knocked on the door, they were greeted by his wife, Dolores. The agents explained that they believed her husband was actually John List, the fugitive who had been missing for nearly 2 decades. Dolores was stunned. Like most people would be in that situation, she could hardly believe what she was hearing. The accusations seemed to come completely out of nowhere. She had never suspected that the man she married could be someone else.
I have never known Robert to be anything but a sweet and gentle man of good character.
Certain that the agents were mistaken, Dolores told them where they could find her husband. Bob Clark, she explained, was at his accounting office. 2 FBI agents went to the office and approached him there. When they spoke with him, he firmly denied the accusation. He insisted he was not John List. The agents then brought him to FBI headquarters for further questioning. There, they took his fingerprints and compared them with the fingerprints of John List that had been on record for years. The result was clear. The fingerprints matched perfectly. There was no longer any doubt. The man known as Robert Clark was in fact John List. That same day, nearly 18 years after the murders, John List was finally placed under arrest. On June 29, 1989, 63-year-old John List was extradited from Virginia to New Jersey to face first-degree murder charges for the 1971 killing of his entire family. The arrest and transfer drew intense national attention. One of the people who later spoke directly with John List was criminal psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Simmering, who was hired by the state to evaluate his mental condition. During a videotaped interview, John List appeared calm and polite. He was soft-spoken, careful with his words, and emotionally controlled. Most striking was his lack of remorse. Rather than expressing guilt, he described the murders as something unfortunate but necessary, maintaining that his family was better off in heaven. After the interview, Dr. Simmering shared his professional opinion. He concluded that John List suffered from an obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, a condition marked by rigidity, emotional repression, and an extreme need for control. However, he found no evidence of a severe mental illness that would excuse the crimes. In his view, there was no psychiatric or legal justification that could reduce List's responsibility for what he had done. As prosecutors prepared their case, List's defense team began shaping their strategy. They did not deny the murders. Instead, they planned to argue that his personality disorder had driven his actions, hoping it might lessen his culpability in the eyes of the court. The trial began on April 2nd, 1990, in New Jersey Superior Court. From the start, there was no dispute about the central facts. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed that John List had killed his family. The only question for the jury was whether he had been mentally capable of planning and deliberately carrying out the murders. The prosecution argued that he was. Prosecutor Eleanor Clark told the court that while John List may have had an obsessive-compulsive personality, he clearly understood his actions and carefully planned them. According to the state, this meant he was fully responsible and should be found guilty of first-degree murder. The defense presented a different argument. They claimed that List suffered from a diminished mental capacity caused by his personality disorder. His attorney, Elijah Miller, acknowledged the killings, but argued that John List's rigid thinking and emotional limitations prevented him from making rational choices. On that basis, the defense asked the jury to consider a lesser charge of second-degree murder. To support the prosecution's case, psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Simmering took the stand. He rejected the idea that John List had been acting on autopilot. In his professional opinion, John List always had a choice and was mentally capable of understanding and controlling his actions. While he agreed that List had a serious personality disorder, he emphasized that it did not rise to the level of legal insanity. In simple terms, the prosecution's message was clear. John List may have been deeply disturbed, but he was not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he chose to do it. The prosecution's most compelling evidence was a letter John List had written to his pastor shortly after the murders. He admitted full responsibility for the killings, essentially confessing to the crime himself. Beyond the confession, the prosecution highlighted what they saw as the hypocrisy in List's reasoning. He had believed that murdering his family was a forgivable sin, yet argued that his own suicide would have condemned him. This contradiction underscored the calculated and deliberate nature of his actions. The trial lasted nearly 2 weeks, with both sides presenting arguments about List's mental state and capacity to plan the murders. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that left little room for surprise. John List was found guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. 3 weeks later, on May 1, 1990, a sentencing hearing was held. For the first time, John List spoke publicly about the crime. He expressed what he called remorse, though he framed it in terms of his mental state at the time, claiming he had been unaccountable for his actions.
That I remain truly sorry for the tragedy that happened in 1971. I feel that due to my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened.
Because the murders occurred before New Jersey reinstated the death penalty, the court could not sentence him to execution. Instead, Judge William Mortimer imposed the maximum possible punishment, 5 consecutive life sentences. John Emil List entered prison in May 1990 and died on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82. List died from complications of pneumonia while serving his sentence at New Jersey State Prison. In the end, he spent only 18 years behind bars, carrying with him the memory of the 17 years he spent evading capture, a grim reminder of both the horrific crime and the long period during which he lived as one of America's most notorious fugitives. I know this story of John List is disturbing enough, but I want you to see another case that shocked investigators for a completely different reason: the Richardson family murders. Tap the screen to watch the full story, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next case. Thank you for watching.